Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. Today's Wednesday, March 17th, and today we're going to be taking a look at some important questions we've been hearing from international educators the last few days and the implications these stories and the types of questions we're asking can have on what we do here in international education. We're going to be looking at three questions that we find each week from the various news stories that we've cataloged and put out on our Monday morning newsletter, all the SMIE News Fit to Share e-newsletter. You can find that, a recent copy of this week's edition. I'll be dropping into the comments section on the Facebook page. For those watching on repeat on YouTube channels or on our Facebook page, you can look to the comments section to get that on the Facebook page. Thank you, though, to those that are listening on podcast, various providers that make the Midweek Roundup available each week. We're glad to be coming to you while you're running, walking, or enjoying your day-to-day work experience or downtime. So thanks for making us a part of your week. For those who haven't been a part of the Roundup before, it's every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a live chat about topics of the day in the forms of questions that can help us reframe how we think about international education as it impacts us here in the United States, and not only how we deal with various international issues in the U.S., but also how other countries are dealing with various international related issues. So we'll talk about that in a global, through the global lens of what's happening in the world today with the global pandemic and its impact on everything we do. In almost every phase of life, we've been impacted by the coronavirus in one way or another. Some of us who have gotten the vaccine already are feeling much more positive and upbeat about the future. Others who are well down the list of who's might be getting them may be having a different story. And that's the perspective we need on how we view all things that we're dealing with in international education these days, is the impact of the pandemic. Just because we're doing well now with vaccine implementation, perhaps here in the United States, doesn't mean that every country is going to be in that situation. And certainly that'll be part of the longer term impact of the pandemic on our world and on our profession. But let's jump into the first question of the day, and that is, what is the state of U.S.-China student interest these days? And that's an important one, I think, because this past week there were quite a few different stories that popped up, and we'll cover them and drop the links to most of them in the comments section. But I want to start this off today because China is kind of ever present in our minds as international educators, particularly on the inbound international side, but also for study abroad. There's no doubt that that has an impact. That country is a massive interest to a number of countries and students in various countries around the world. But we look at what's happening with China. We know how dependent many U.S. institutions have become on China for students, international students, going back to the mid-2000s. And this is something that I think we look at and see for international educators. It's one of our biggest partners economically, but also in education terms, certainly on inbound side, it's been very important. But during the Obama administration, there was 100,000 strong initiatives to China. And that was important in opening the doors for U.S. students to see China as a destination for study abroad. And that certainly raised the profile quite a bit of China in educational terms, in terms of where institutions place value in relationships and developing those. What we've seen in the last 4 years, obviously all the rhetoric of the Trump administration towards China as the big bad enemy, the new enemy in the room that we need to be focusing much of our attention on. There are still certain elements of that we're hearing from other sources, that the Biden administration's approach towards China will be fairly similar in terms of policy, but will be obviously handled in a much more diplomatic way than perhaps the Trump administration did. And part of that challenge is dealing with visas. And this is something that when we look at the current state of affairs, certainly the state of affairs with U.S. consulates and embassies that have been basically closed for routine services since February last year, over a year now. We now have huge backlogs of interest from Chinese students who still want to come to the United States and pursue their education that haven't been able to go for visas in country. And that's something that, because the U.S. consulates have not been open. Now, in conversations with colleagues who work in the State Department, there are two kind of elements that go into play that impact our U.S. consulate or embassy's ability to be fully open. First are in-country permissions that need to be earned or granted in order for the embassies to be able to operate at full capacity, to be able to have routine services. And the other is embassy staffing and willingness to and local decisions on whether to open or not. Now, in China, since February, March last year, the U.S. embassies and consulates have been largely closed. The availability of emergency appointments for student visas has been there since probably July to late August. That's when those became available at many of the consulates in China. However, all but one have even availability where students can go to the visa wait times site and see when the earliest visa appointment is being offered. First one right now is for, I think, August 12th for Guangzhou. So that is obviously cutting it close for a lot of institutions that would be starting in the fall. And that is clearly not a tenable situation for U.S. institutions to have a second year, much like Australia is dealing with now, having two academic years in a row where new students have not been able to enter the country to begin their courses and have had to start online if they were to start at all. And right now there's a petition actually out to members of the through the NAFSA member interest group for China that the Pi News did an article on this past week. It's called China F1 Student Visa Crisis for 2021-2022 school year. The backlog of cases for now 13 months it's not going to be possible to fit all those students that might want to come to the U.S. Into such a small window of time that is normally already fully booked for student visas from May to through to early September. So this is going to be a real story we want to keep an eye on here. And there's actually a petition for those that have followed change.org petitions or have used those in the past. There's now a petition that's closing in on 500 signatures that talks about this alert. It's from Andrew Chen, who is the Chief Learning Officer at Ho Ren Group and Vice Chair of the NAFSA China MIG. And there are appointments are occasionally available, but then they're canceled in China. That's just Andrew's on the ground kind of experience in terms of what's going on there. Guangzhou is the only one that's, as I mentioned, that has availability right now, and that's just not going to be possible for all students who want to get visa appointments for the fall to go in one consulate starting August 12th and be able to get in and come from all over China to do this. So clearly something needs to give here. And we're hoping that there is, I've got calls out to some of my colleagues who are in the State Department who can maybe shed a little bit more light on what those two situations are. As I mentioned earlier, is it local requirements or local regulations that are preventing the embassies and consulates from being fully open? Part of that in the past has been staffing. That staff that were evacuated once the pandemic hit have not been let back into the country. Some of that has happened. Obviously, they've been able to keep some staff, either locally hired staff to maintain the offices, but not certainly all the U.S. citizens and permanent resident staff that work these embassies and consulates have been able to get back into the country in order to do their jobs. So that early on was one piece. I don't know if that's still the case, but that could be a potential roadblock. The other is, are there local requirements, COVID protections that need to be in place that I know in other countries there's been a lot of retrofitting of the visa areas to make them more socially distanced and have policies in place that will meet local regulations. And that may be another piece too, because if both of those aren't in sync, and though they may have local or they may have the staff ready to go, but the local regulations are not allowing them to open fully, then that is something we really need to look at. If there maybe one of the things that may be out there, I'm not saying this is it, but if one of the requirements that there be better monitoring equipment of people coming in and out of embassies, which seems a little bit off because that's sovereign territory for the embassy that is physically there. It's not that the country where the embassy is located is not territory per se of that country. It's the country of the embassy. It is kind of you've seen the spy movies when people are trying to get to the embassies spies trying to get to their embassies to become to be on home territory or home soil. Well, I don't know what the details are, and I'm not going to speculate any further there. But there could be requirements that the Chinese government is putting on embassies in terms of how they can open, and that might be something to look at down the road. And as soon as I have any information back on what the real story is or what it's likely to be, I'll certainly share that with you here. So we've got the visa issue right now, and obviously that's a very significant one we all need to be aware of. But we also have a series of stories that may be indicating, as Karen Fisher, a very prominent Chronicle writer at Chronicle of Higher Ed, who has followed the Chinese student journeys, many Chinese student journeys in the United States, going back to her work with Michigan State and University of Illinois, and following groups of students as they have from China who have come to the United States. So she's been well immersed in this field for a number of years. One of her recent stories this week was, is this the end of the romance between Chinese students and American colleges? And she lays out a fairly actually convincing case that that obviously we had a peak in 2017, 2018 in terms of Chinese students in the United States, where 1 in 3 international students is in America right now. International students are from China. And obviously the colleges embrace these students for a variety of reasons. The cultural diversity they brought to campus, tuition revenue obviously, and that drives a lot of institutions and their bottom lines. Right now that relationship has been faltering for a number of reasons. COVID has certainly not helped. There's also interesting how we've seen this past fall and spring, where Common App released its data, where they've seen a resurgence in international applications, up almost across the board in international undergraduate interest in the United States through the Common App. Much of that driven by test optional policies that are giving hope to students from outside the U.S. that might have their one chance to get into top schools that have gone test optional. But the one country that kind of sticks out in all that data is even this year, there's an 18% drop in Chinese applicants for fall 2021 through Common App. So she's looking at that data. She's looking at obviously the rhetoric that's been coming and going between our two countries over the last 4 or 5 years. And she also reveals some majority of American support for that actually now support limits on Chinese students and at U.S. colleges. And that's according to Pew Research Center survey released last week, where 55% of respondents told Pew they favored restrictions on Chinese students, with 1 in 5 strongly in support. So that's troubling when you think about it on the broader scale. But is that to say that those are exclusive? And a lot of that has probably the majority opinions there have been driven a lot by the rhetoric of the last 4 or 5 years about Chinese spies and infiltrators, and even a congressman getting duped by a Chinese spy and having a relationship with her. So these are the kinds of things that shape public opinion, and the reality on campuses is probably a lot different than what we're talking about here with this Pew Research. But what we look at with the United States relating to as a premier destination. If you're familiar with agencies in China, they are a very prominent part of the higher educational system, our access to that system. But for overseas students looking to go overseas from China, but their organization, BOSA, Beijing Overseas Studies Service Association, kind of a group of recruitment agents that accredited ones, recently analyzed the preference, and this is Karen's article still, more than 2.3 million prospective students and families who used their search platform, found that Britain has actually edges out the United States as the destination of choice right now. Very interesting, and I haven't seen that kind of data yet that shows that, but certainly the UK has certainly had a surge in Chinese interest over the last few years, as has Australia, New Zealand, Canada to a lesser extent, as well as the United States. But they say the one conclusion that this consulting group says student interest in the U.S. remains, but the demand may be plateauing for the U.S. But Britain, one of the reasons they I think have seen an advantage and maybe a rising in standing among Chinese parents and students is that they made efforts to ensure international students could enter the country during the pandemic, whereas that's been prohibited for Chinese students without going through third country quarantines. So, and obviously the visa issue that we've just covered. So the UK visa system is set up very differently than the US one, where students don't go for interviews at the British embassies and consulates overseas. They apply through a third-party visa provider that manages that process, and they obviously the government and the Foreign Office has to approve those visas for students, but there's a third-party organization that doesn't require an in-person interview that allows the UK to have had a much bigger, stronger leg up for last fall, and that will continue again because they have a much better, more well-defined system in place. So there's a lot of articles in here. Another one that we're going to put in is is from Pew Research Center that says most Americans support tough stance towards China on human rights and economic issues. So no surprises on those, and I think that's been fairly consistent. Then we have INTED, one of my favorite groups out there, consulting groups out there and service providers on the higher ed scene, international higher ed scene. And they have an article and they have a series coming up for institutions that you can pre-register for on China, and it's entitled Chinese Students Want to Hear From You. So there's issues here that this covers. It talks about some of the issues that were raised in Karen's article and the visa access challenges. Then this is there is some surprising information, despite all the rhetoric and despite all the hurdles that Chinese students have had recently, is the same gentleman who spearheaded this petition, Andrew Chen from Holren. They've done research with INTED, surveying 20,000 plus Chinese parents last month, 2,000 plus Chinese students that this fall attended classes in China for Syracuse, Rutgers, Clark, Babson, Penn State, Tulane, and others in U.S.-style classrooms run by SMIE. And we've talked about that option where SMIE, obviously they weren't using their study abroad facilities for students that were potentially going to China. So they allowed the institution I just referenced to be part of kind of their pop-up study hub that allowed those cohorts to study in person at these centers run by SMIE and take their classes together for their first year. So that's still going on. So there's 2,000 plus students that took that option. So they're also sharing some research that they've done on access to the Chinese markets. So that's something certainly that tends to point to a more positive outcome or positive future for U.S.-China international student interest relationships. Then you have something that kind of throws it back to the last 4 years. The U.S. Senate passed a bill, unanimous consent bill, in the Senate, not yet been taken up by the House, to target Confucius institutes. We've talked about that history here on the Roundup before, on the various institutions who've had Confucius institutes that have had issues related to academic freedom and controlled by Chinese government or influence in who gets invited to campus or who gets protested in terms of speakers that might be invited. So there's institutional control issues there for some of these institutes, and that has forced a number to close. Some of that happened as a result of a 2018 law prohibiting colleges that host Confucius institutes from also receiving Department of Defense funding for Chinese language study, that's seen as conflicting there. So a number of institutions closed for that reason. Now, if this bill becomes law, what the U.S. Senate bill just approved last Thursday would restrict colleges hosting Confucius institutes from receiving all federal funding other than student financial aid, so that would still be allowed, unless the college ensures that the agreements establishing the institute has clear provisions protecting academic freedom and grants the college full managerial authority over the institute. And that's something that typically there's been pushback from the Chinese side as those have been established. So we'll see what happens with that. There's going to be more to come on that front. There's also, as a result of the last year, in addition to the visas, in addition to the political rhetoric and all these other challenges, there's also been, we talked about how important agents are in China. Agents have been reporting that they are very much what they call neutral to pessimistic about promoting online study with prospective students. And that's as many as 78% of Chinese agents saying they're not interested in making online programs part of their portfolio. This is a Pi News study. This was in-depth interviews with 25 agencies. And this is part of the fallout from COVID has been those Chinese students that were looking to go study in country have not been able to do so. They've been forced to, if they wanted to still go to that country eventually, they had to start online. And a lot of the agents are expressing, based on feedback they're getting from students, significant dissatisfaction with that approach. So we'll see what the future for that lies. Shifting gears to the second question, again, told you we're going to spend a lot of time on China today. The second one is an article that came out from, in full disclosure, a former employer that I did consulting with for a number of years, Platform Q Education. But for those that who knew it under College Week Live as a different name brand, that's the parent company, Platform Q Education. Their service now is private platform services transferred into what they call into a new brand. It's branded differently, called Conduit, and that's been something that they've used for institutions to hold that have their own environments, private online environments for events, to invite students in, to have content available all the time. And they've certainly seen back in the spring when everything was going online, even for domestic students, just domestic admissions offices, where they needed to have admitted student events, yield events in the spring and early summer, that they got a lot of new business as a result of that kind of need for institutions to have these virtual events available. So they asked the question, is it time for digital first admissions? And certainly it's under the guise of the truth about stealth and stealth applicants, stealth interest in terms of prospective students who visit your website and may never inquire formally or apply because they didn't like what they saw. So they don't even become actual inquiries in your mind. The presence of stealth applicants in that these are the first time you actually ever hear about a student is that know that they're interested in your institution is when they apply for admission. So that's what that stealth applicant trend came from. So they make the case here. What if I told you, that's in the article, what if I told you that your stealth applicants were never stealth? You just weren't paying attention and tracking when they were engaging with your institution digitally. And obviously, their tracking is the piece. You're always on. If you have, unless you have specific IP addresses and have the time and staffing to go investigate all that and know that, oh, this student has been on our website 5 or 6 times before they apply. No one's doing that, I guarantee you. So, but what is I think an important piece of the puzzle here that I think has great value for institutions in terms of an overall strategy. And I talk about this in my current series for IDP Connect on the 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management that I'm branding now as part of my services for SMIE consulting. Is this what I call this? These 6 Ps are where you need a much bigger picture when you're looking at the overall international student experience at your campuses. Kind of a cradle-to-grave prospect to alumni and how their experiences impact their overall belief and value that they place on the institution. But what we're talking about here is having a strategy, having a plan, having platforms in place. That's one of the 6 Ps, planning and platforms, that you have available content to your prospective student audiences that is not just words on a page. It's video. Video that tells stories, is institutional branding that is helping future students see current students living out their day-to-day experiences. And that's something I think not a lot of schools do and have available. Certainly those that are on a fairly pricey platform like Conduit certainly can have that availability for 24/7 content, but you can do that in other ways too in terms of how that video content is hosted on your site, how connected your social channels are in terms of that video content, to provide it on a regular basis, on a 24/7 basis, which is basically how students around the world find us, find our information, and having a streaming strategy. And that's one of the articles that, one of the sections of this article that I think are important. It's not just web strategy, not just social strategy, but a streaming strategy, digital marketing strategy. So, and that's based on the simple fact that 80% of internet traffic is video related, and institutions that don't have strong video presence are missing opportunities to connect with your future students. So whether you need 24/7 streaming video content, I think that's a very easy answer. Yes, you do. But if you don't have it, it's how do you generate it, and what are the important features you need to have as part of that strategy. So that's something I work with my clients on every day in terms of developing the kinds of messages and who's telling that message as part of that video strategy, and particularly now in a pandemic-filled world where your current students are your best advocates. They always have been, but even more so now, that in terms of being able to tell that story of how their experiences have been studying remotely, being on your campus, attending classes in a hybrid format, whatever the case may be. They need to be able to tell that story for you, for the believability factor to really be there for future students. Now, where the believability is probably at its coming to a nadir is in China when it comes to beliefs about international students. We've talked at length here on the Roundup. This is question number 3. Has China become fed up with international students? And this is going to be a fairly short one, but it is, China has become, over the last 5-10 years, a much more highly sought after or attractive option for those that want to study in English in a country that is booming and has spent a lot of money and expended a lot of soft power to make itself an attractive place for international students. This is part of China's efforts to become much more prominent on the global stage in terms of their universities that are ranked. We've shared also in our newsletter this week new emerging countries rankings that Times Higher Ed put out. that has the majority of the top 10, 7 out of 10. Top 10 are Chinese institutions, universities. I think as a country, they probably would not, though they always want to be on a top 10 list and monopolize that kind of a list, they would rather be doing that on the global rankings of all universities, including all Western nations. They're not there yet and have a long way to go, but their plan has been to expand the prestige of their universities. Part of what they've been doing over the last 10, 15 years has been bringing more international students in. And a lot of this is driven by BRI initiatives, Belt and Road initiatives, the money that Chinese government has spent building up infrastructure in South and East Asia, throughout Africa, and even into Central Asia and Europe now. So we've documented that here before, but you're also seeing the scholarship dollars that they've spent to bring students in, particularly from developing countries. And there might be a butting of heads happening here now, and a pushback from Chinese, not necessarily institutions, but certainly from maybe general public, that there's actually been a measure introduced brought up 3 issues meant to curb what he calls indiscriminate acceptance of international students into the country's universities. This article is coming from Chinese publication, The Beijinger, and then there's another from Global Times out of, I think this one might be Singapore, might be the U.S., the South China edition. But this also says Chinese political advisor proposes to tighten admission standards for international students. And this one is, this proposal was made by Gao Yanming, chairman of Hebei Ocean Shipping Company in Hebei Province, and also a member of the National Committee on Chinese People Political Consultative Conference. Yes, wonderful titles that they have here. And he's proposing that all international students should meet the required credits for admission, with the exception of those funded by foreign governments who can have lower admission scores. Chinese universities should not blindly pursue a quota of enrolled students while ignoring the quality of students, compromising the reputation of national academia, and breaching education rights. He also highlighted the need to standardize and optimize a scholarship policy for international students in China. So there's definite pushback occurring. Whether or not this gains any traction, it's certainly, we're not sure on whether it will or not, but that there's been a hashtag around this campaign that has gained 140 million views on China's Twitter-like Sina Weibo as of Sunday last week. So Chinese netizens are sharing their support for this proposal, saying that international students and domestic students should be treated equally. And that is kind of a pushback on perhaps the more deluxe level of services that are available for international students on Chinese campuses compared to Chinese students that attend Chinese universities, that they're not given this. Chinese students are given far fewer benefits than their overseas counterparts. So interesting perspective on international education as it's happening in China, and perhaps coming to the signs that China is becoming fed up with international students, or at least this proposal has, and some of the social feedback that whether you can take it with a grain of salt or not is another story. But certainly a lot to take in this week, and China is certainly a big part of that, coming and going. But we'll certainly keep you in the loop on all that's happening in China, as it will impact your potential students coming to your campus. So thanks again for being a part of the Roundup this week. Looking forward to connecting with you again in the days and weeks to come. Have a wonderful day. Cheers.